Hi, Ashton.
Hey Laura, how's it going?
Better.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
I'm
I
gonna
have
see.
internet now.
Oh, good, good. Glad to hear that. Oh, cool. So we're live. All right, I'll get started on the summary. Today we're going to be covering in the George and Mary Adams translation. This is pages 201 to 221 of chapter 4. And or if you're working with paragraph numbers, paragraph 71 to 93 in chapter 4. And so just to touch back to last week, in Steiner's narration, there had just been, with the advent of the Earth epoch, the severance of the moon after the sun. And so he begins this section that we're looking at by giving an account of what he describes as like the outer development of the severance. And so he talks about animals, as he described it, as old relics or relics of the old moon evolution of beings who had not, I guess, attained to the point where they could receive an eye. And then the plant kingdom he describes as arising from this interplay between the sun and the earth, and he describes it as the sun's astrality and the Earth's like ethereal aspect. And so like the plant cover is like an aspect of the Earth itself. And then the mineral kingdom he describes as also a kind of holdout of beings who on Saturn uh, had only developed to the point where yeah, I guess after the moon severed from the Earth in the Earth epoch, these beings were already very dense and could only, I guess, find manifestation in like a only physical form. And then he describes how the spirits of form are like ready to give the spark of the eye to human beings because the vehicle had become suitable for it. And also, this is just something that I found I needed to constantly remind myself what beings, in the more traditional um, Dionysus Areopagite higher hierarchies, which beings are the spirits of form, and those, as I understand it, are the Exousiae or the Elohim. So just to keep that in mind, and they are of the second hierarchy, which is also associated with the Logos, Christ. He goes on to say that, with this addition of the eye, the spark of fiery spark from the spirits of form, there's a new independence in the body. He calls it the body free existence, which is like his way of referring to like what we would now call the life after death. But this was before the advent of death. So he describes it as the body free. He uses this phrase. I think that's kind of important to pay attention to, like that difference. But that there's a new kind of independence, whereas formerly he describes, and I just love this phrase, we were membered into the sublime organism composed of higher beings above us. And so kind of, just continuous with that sort of necessary activity. Now there's a new independence. Um, but now with this, with the severance of the moon, and we also have the sun. Remember that Steiner describes the reason the moon, I guess, left the Earth was to free it up from some of those densifying forces that were then taken up into the moon from without. So there's more this kind of like balance between the like accelerated sort of etheric, I guess, influence from the sun and then the densifying from the moon, and that there are these higher beings on the moon that are also as kind of reflections of the activity of the sun beings, intending to guide the human eye through its future course of evolution, but something happens. Um, so yeah, so the aspiration of these moon beings would have been to kind of transmute what developed in the former epoch when through this kind of alternation of dark and light, sun and moon, there was this phase during the kind of like cosmic winter or cosmic night when the human proto-humans would come into their sclerotic forms and have this kind of independent picture consciousness developing. That in this next epoch, the moon beings that have severed from the earth, and now we have Earth, sun, and moon. We have like a triadic process rather than just a dyad. Um, they're intending to like work with this kind of Luciferic intervention and to fill it with wisdom, a reflected wisdom of the world, so that there's a kind of attunement of that inner picturing with the cosmic process. And so that's a kind of there's a non-identical repetition of this emergence of the picture consciousness, but with this kind of higher intention to transmute it back towards the providence, I guess you could say. But again, now there's another non-identical repetition of the Luciferic rebellion, and so that he describes these beings as not from the moon, not suitable to go over to the severance of the sun or the moon with those higher beings, but they've instead been banished to the earth. And I just love the use of that phrase. I mean, just think of fallen angels. And um, and so Steiner says, whereas, and I kind of found this a bit confusing. He said, whereas their intervention during the moon epoch was of a real benefit to human beings because it brought this sort of free, independent picture consciousness. Now there's like a resistance set up between these Luciferic beings who are kind of intensifying that picture consciousness by I guess granting the power to regulate and control the images independently. Now there's like a kind of yeah, conflict set up. And so I just wondered like um whether or not this is much more of a conflict than the I guess the rebellion in the prior epoch, and if it could, and it's only sort of could be described as an issue from the and also could only be described as a benefit insofar as like the attainment of independent consciousness only posteriori, so only after it has occurred. Anyways, that's just a question that I had. Yes, so he says the effect of this second sort of Luciferic rebellion, or I guess a continuation of it, is that the astral body became independent and no longer or would not be subservient to the higher member, the I. So like rather the I is dependent on, I guess, cultivating the astral so that it becomes an instrument, but there's this inheritance of the kind of Luciferic deviation from the cosmic, the moon, the moon beings imbuing the providential course of things. Um, so yeah, those two major consequences of the independence of the astral body is this power to freely regulate and control images. And also the fact that the astral body, the eye is now dependent on the astral body to some extent. Um, And so the effect of this is that he describes, and it reminds me of what Angus said a couple weeks ago, just connecting this with Plato's parable of the cave, that because of this Luciferic intervention, human beings did not perceive the world um, truly, I guess you could say, that they weren't like perceiving in accordance with the higher sun beings. He says, if we had seen it rightly, the astral would have been drawn into the eye, and the humans would have been content simply to feel the spark of fire bequeathed to them by the spirits of form, remaining subject to their commands in all that appertained to the outer fire. Oh, and here's another interesting parallel with myth. He says that the reason, so like with this Luciferic intervention, with this capacity to regulate and control images, um, it severed from the providential course of things, um, that there's this connection between the fire of the eye as this kind of aspect of ourselves through which we intend, and the fire and the atmosphere of the earth, and that this independent picture consciousness is connected with this sort of temptation to start to try and control the outer environs through manipulating the warmth. And that is the reason why according to Steiner, humans descend more fully into the materiality than we were supposed to. And I think of this as a parallel to the myth of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, and thought that was cool. So also, a consequence of this independent, picture consciousness is the potential of error and unregulated passion. And so illness arises for the first time, according to Steiner, because of this, and death. And this is something I'd be curious to hear other people's thoughts about, because I've heard Steiner talk about, in the lecture recordings I've listened to and read, he connects the astral with death. So he says, henceforth, man or humankind was unable to feel their single life on earth as a continuation of body-free existence. He now received such earthly impressions as he could experience through the astral element with which he had been inoculated, and these impressions join themselves on the forces that destroy life. So I don't quite understand what that means. It's a riddle to me, but I'll proceed. And it also important in this whole sequence of things is that to kind of work with this disruption, this sort of emphasis on the astral body, higher beings withdraw the ether body of humans so that it's not under their control, and rather it's like under the control of these higher beings with providential aspirations. And because of that, life after death becomes increasingly veiled, or that the Luciferic rebellion. There's so much here. I'm going to try and get to the most important things. So interestingly, so like with this accumulation of Earth experience, there's like kind of a memory image of the Earth life, which is connected with the fact of the reincarnation. But also he says like during this process of the Earth, I guess, evolving a body suitable for the descent of human spirits, that some humans left and went to go live in other spheres, but eventually came back once there were proper vehicles. So there's like this mix of the humans, or the humans that were on the Earth the whole time, which he will call sun humans, and humans from Jupiter and Mars and Saturn who are coming back later. And so there's this kind of very complex mixture of like karmic development. And he says there's a more intense eye experience among the sun humans. Also, he says with this withdrawal of the ether body, there's an intensified capacity for memory and also a kind of atavistic feeling knowledge, like a kind of perception of he says, potencies of various creatures on the earth, and a way to like kind of work with those energies. Maybe think of like when Steiner talks about the Gemüt, and just this kind of, yeah, atavistic clairvoyance. And this is really interesting. So the Luciferic intervention and this introduction of the potential for air, Steiner says, also brings this new experience of fear, because of erring and, I guess, not wanting to err after having some kind of experience of erring. And so he says this invitation, I guess, to fall through Lucifer, through erring, brought us more deeply into the earth, but and into this experience of fear, and thus into connection with Ahriman, who he says was already at work to evince irregularity far earlier in evolution than the Luciferic. I think that's really interesting. There's a kind of non-homogeneous timeline of activities going on. So then he talks about how a higher ego of the sun among the sun beings was protecting the ether bodies of the humans who remained on Earth, like throughout these developments. And he says this higher ego eventually is Christ. Um, and that eventually, like, it starts, Atlantis emerges, and there's like this sort of continental tradition of oracles that correspond to the different higher egos of the planetary spheres and the humans who correspond to them. And that um, that a particular group of individuals connected with the sun ego, the Christ, redirect the Luciferic gift toward a purification of the astral body so that there's this potential to perceive through the ether body. And he says this, what basically is like a kind of communing with the spirits of form or the Elohim or the Exousiai, and them imparting their leader, who is, he says, is the Christ, and his sort of intentions for cosmic evolution and prefiguring the coming of Christ. He says, "Whoso is touched by the might of the sun being sees the Christ coming towards the earth." Um, but only through the reflected radiance of the moon beings, he says elsewhere. And I'll just wrap up by saying a little bit more about the sort of like diversity of oracles, the oracular. So there's one for each planet, and they're kind of like correspondingly or graded according to their like subtlety. So like he says, and it reminded me of what he describes in interdisciplinary astronomy, where there's this kind of like homology between the human form with Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter having more of a connection with the head, and Mercury and Venus with the limbs, and the Sun and Earth forming this kind of composite as two poles of a composite in the middle. And that these various oracular traditions and the revelations they receive have characteristics that maybe correspond to these correspondences with the head and the limbs. He says the secrets attained through like the Venus and Mercury oracles are more in thoughts and pictures that are individually attained. And those from Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter are more revelations from above in symbolic pictures, whereas the sun in the middle is direct revelation in human concepts. So it's this kind of mediation. And that the Venus, Mercury, and Vulcan oracles, oracular traditions are closer to the earth and also more luciferic. But he doesn't say it like it's like a bad thing necessarily. And then finally, I'll just say really interesting. He says another consequence of this withdrawing of the ether body is the emergence of speech. And so you could think about it as again, like this sort of intervention of the higher beings trying to like work with the Luciferic intervention to redirect it. And so speech as this flows out of this independent picture consciousness as a means to reunify after this kind of like internalization and individuation and sort of like being turning away from the sublime cosmic organism. Speech has this capacity to bring us together once again, but after that has transpired. So anyway, I'll stop there. So much in that section, so much in all these sections, but I look forward to hearing what everybody has to say. Thanks for your time. Go ahead, Bruce.
Well, first I wanted to thank Ashton again for a great summary. I find it so interesting to hear what other people take out of these works, and it'd just be interesting to do this on a number of times with hearing different people's take, because they read just completely different things than I do in them sometimes, and I think that's really great. So thank you so much. I hope that when my work settles down a bit, I can do another summary later on. But I wanted to return to something Lorenzo said 2 times ago, and that was in a chat, he mentioned that we were falling into naive realism. And certainly Steiner's language makes it really easy to fall into naive realism with this book. And I've struggled with what the alternative is. And I'm not sure I've got a good answer, and the answers that I have are pretty weird. But it's got to be pretty weird. It's got to be. So I think rather than kind of give a lecture here, I think I would like to open that for discussion. I mean, how are we to understand these things if we are not going to see the etheric body as something like its physical thing that's there that has certain characteristics? If the astral body is not a physical thing that's there that has certain kinds of characteristics, how are we to understand what Steiner is saying?
Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, that's a great, a challenge to raise. As I was reading this, I was, reminded of Plato multiple times, and also, in particular, in the Timaeus, when Timaeus is giving his kind of um, uh, mythic picture of the coming to be of the cosmos, and he says, "This is a likely story." And so I kind of, when I read this, there's so much that is in it that is compelling, but I also try to kind of like keep in mind like that it's a likely story, and I think that can be helpful. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Ashton and Bruce, for that that question. I think of what Steiner says in these pages about the way in which, because of the Luciferic influence on our astral bodies, we became blinded to the true significance of the sun, and so we can't feel or see or receive what the spirits of form are trying to give to us, but that blockage that the Luciferic beings provide is also essential for our freedom. That without that, we would have continued in the proper evolutionary sequence in a way, but as guided by leading strings, as Steiner likes to say, instead of being able to achieve a kind of etheric and astral awareness on our own. And this kind of leads into what I wanted to share a little bit here, which is the importance of Lucifer in the Luciferic beings in this section, and the ambiguity of Lucifer here. That on Old Moon, this rebellion was very important as a sort of boon to human evolution, but then during this Earth phase of evolution, Lucifer becomes a bit more problematic, but at the same time is sort of forcing us to become free, if I could use that paradoxical sort of statement. But I went to another of Steiner's lectures to get more details here that he leaves out of occult science. GA 105 in particular, Universe, Earth, and Man is its English translation. And Steiner here says that the Luciferic beings during this time of Earth evolution were actually preparing for the Christ to come to Earth. And he speaks of some initiates at this time being aware of the Christ coming. And he says that only at the time of Christ's coming was man ready for what these Luciferic beings desired. Those who uttered the words Christus verus Luciferus, meaning Christ, the true Lucifer, knew well what they were saying. This is an esoteric statement that's from GA 105, August 10th, 1908. And so there's something, quite ambiguous about the role that Lucifer plays at different phases of evolution. I think also of St. Augustine's famous line, Felix culpa, blessed sin, because it does afford us this capacity for freedom, and love is only possible as a free deed. And then I also thought of the book of Enoch, an apocryphal Hebrew text that speaks of sort of Enoch's visions. Enoch's supposed to be the great grandfather of Noah, I think, and has this vision of fallen angels who teach human beings at the time various arts and sciences, how to make weapons out of steel, how to practice astrology, how to use various plant medicines, and writing, interestingly, and that this precipitates eventually the flood, because these were gifts from heaven that human beings were not supposed to receive yet, according to the original plan, right? But this, I feel like, is, in Steiner's terms, an example of Lucifer trying to usher things along a little bit more quickly, giving us these capacities to become more wise in a sense, and also free, so that we're not just mirrors of the macrocosm, but as microcosmic likenesses, we have this inner spark that we have to cultivate ourselves. And so Lucifer becomes this figure who in some sense is a bearer of light, right? And that Christ is the true Lucifer, as Steiner says in this very esoteric statement, which I've shared on the Substack as a note if you want to read. There's more to it. It just has me thinking about the way in which Steiner allows us to really deepen our understanding of evil. That yes, it's a source of resistance, but that resistance is essential for meeting resistance is essential for evolution. So just wanted to throw that in the mix.
Thanks, Matt. Max, go ahead.
Thank you. Just to pick up on Matt's comment, I think Lucifer, the Luciferic influence, is also, it's present continually through the Old Testament. It's also present, I think, in the form of the serpent in the garden. The esoteric tradition around the beginning of Genesis is that it's not just an accident or just purely for the sake of temptation that the tree of knowledge is present there in the garden, but it's rather something that was going to be granted to man at the proper moment. And Lucifer here once again is expediting the course of evolution. Now I'd like to try to tie this back to Bruce's comment and challenge to us. I think Lucifer, if I understand right, Lucifer is responsible for this, the magnetization of our attention into our senses. It sort of draws us that way in this extroverted motion. So we become fascinated with the phenomenal experience that we receive through the senses. That itself would be a very different experience than what we actually have today. And that's because the harmonic influence then comes. And basically the harmonic influence is present in the paradigm of the tacit conceptualization by which we order those phenomenal experiences. So that's the paradigm behind objective existence and materialism, and the entire Vorstellungsart, to use Goethe's word, way of representing that basically affixes our phenomenal sensory experiences to these material objects. Basically, if it were merely the Luciferic influence, we would have the experience of more floating fields of sensory experience. It's the harmonic influence that again kind of binds those more ephemeral sensory experiences to these fixed material objects. I'd like to suggest that the way to understand the etheric body, for instance, and the astral body is actually to try to, and I think Steiner invites us to do this with some of these images, to try to peel apart some of the layers of our actual experience that are present for us, but that have been in a certain way because of those twin influences of Lucifer and Ahriman, are more comprehensive and multi-dimensional, for lack of a better word, experience that would involve all these different strata of existence have been in a way flattened onto our purely external material perceptions. But if we can start to peel them apart, so to speak, or delaminate them, then we will begin to recognize these further dimensions that are already present in our ordinary everyday experience, but are just in a certain way concealed to us by these two influences. I'd like to also pick up on a comment that Ashton made surrounding Plato's Timaeus and the phrase likely story. This is, to my mind, actually quite an unfelicitous translation of Plato's original Greek, because the original Greek, to me, is much more evocative. The word that is translated in English as likely story is actually ikota mython. So ikota is the same root as the word icon. And mython is the same root as, of course, myth. So imagine if you translate likely story as iconic myth, then you get a very different picture. And a myth is different than a novel, for instance. Like novels represented a kind of evolutionary moment in the history of culture, because in a myth, there's a great kind of Greek Roman historian who has a very illustrative statement about this. I had queued it up actually, but now I lost it. But I can find it really, really, really fast. It's something that his name is Sallust or Sallustius. And he says, the universe itself can be called a myth, since bodies and material objects are apparent in it, while souls and intellects are concealed. So the genre of a novel actually starts to lay bare the internal experience that a myth actually just portrays without any, it portrays in terms of external images. So you never hear, in a myth, you never hear about the internal deliberation of the protagonist, for instance, and that's a hallmark feature of the novel. But if we take these scenes that Steiner is presenting before us, and we think of them as iconic myths, we realize, as Sallustius was suggesting, it's always necessary to complement the external image with what is not presented merely through the external image. And this leads back to the kind of the question or theme that was foremost present for me in this reading, is how to understand these processes that on the one hand appear to us as kind of maybe just blind physical powers and processes that are just transpiring over the course of the development of the universe, and then the self-evident fact of our own internal experience, our experience of agency, our experience of freedom. And I think the connecting link is to understand how, or to actually not even understand and also just recognize that everyone that we encounter, if we are going to encounter them as humans and not just human-shaped pieces of matter, we are continually complementing what is externally perceptible to us in terms of their mechanical movements with the intuition of their intention behind those movements. And we, in our own experience, we can, once again, with this movement of taking something that seems kind of compressed and collapsed together, matted down, and trying to expand it, allow it, and to the point that you can begin to perceive these different strata. In our own lives, we experience a whole spectrum or gradient of freedom, extending all the way from basically the mechanical and physical influences on us. And you can see, like, if somebody came up to me and mechanically furrowed my brow together, I would, there's basically nothing I can do because in response to that external mechanical influence. But then there's an entire spectrum leading up to me furrowing my brow volitionally for the sake of illustrating this in conversation with all of you. And it's not a discrete, these are not discrete moments along the continuum, so you have to fill the continuity in, but somewhere between that, so in other words, in the latter case, the intention precedes the execution. So I intend to furrow my brow and then I do it. In the other case, I learn about it after the fact. It's like the execution precedes my understanding of it. And then in the middle you have, and so in in the case that the intention precedes the execution, that's our experience of freedom. It's our experience of realizing, creatively realizing our intentions in the material world. The reverse is the case when the object, when the action is performed mechanically from without. Just consider if somebody came and did that to me, presumably they could be acting, it would appear to me as purely mechanical. In other words, like lacking freedom. But for them, they could have very good reasons to do it, and they could be themselves realizing some intention. Somewhere in the middle, and then again, you have to, with your imagination, make this continuous, not discrete spectrum. Somewhere in the middle is so somewhere between like material and physical causation and agential or intentional causation is emotional causation. It's like if I'm upset about something or if I'm concentrating very deeply, my brow might furrow, and it's neither entirely unfree nor entirely free, and I have much more play and agency in whether I actually act that out, as contrasted to a case in which it's imposed on me from outside. Now, the reason I'm doing this is just to unpack how all these different strata or dimensions, they're present already in the most mundane experiences, and it's for us to try to, starting from what we do know, then extrapolate to what we don't know. Science just assumes that because we don't have this, immediate intuitive perception of the agency behind these powerful forces of nature, that there is no agency behind them, that it doesn't exist. But in a way, C.S. Lewis has a great illustration of the same principle. He says, if I get letters in my mailbox, envelopes in my mailbox, and I open them and I find a letter inside and it has a certain content, it would make no sense to assume that the most reasonable and rational approach is to judge the letters that I can open, the envelopes that I can't open, or to judge the envelopes that I can't open on the basis of the ones that I can. It's like, I don't know that there's anything in those other envelopes that are being delivered to other people, but it's like eminently rational to assume that that they also have letters inside of them, and there's some content written in there on the basis of the letters that I can't open. Science does almost the opposite. It's like, well, on the basis of the ones that we can't open, then maybe there's also no content to there's no internal content to the ones that we can, and maybe it's some kind of elaborate illusion and epiphenomenon of only the external side. So going back to the operation of these powers, it's like we first perceive again these very high cosmic powers operating, and there's one of two approaches. One is we assume that there's no intelligence behind it, and it's somehow just a concatenation of accidents, or we recognize, or we begin with our own self-evident experience of agency and of intelligence, and then work outwards from there, trying to then discern and complement what we experience through our external senses with what we can complement them from our own extrapolation from our own internal experience. I'll stop there, and thank you all.
Thanks for all that, Max. And yeah, that great alternative translation sounds a lot more like what Steiner calls an imagination, the original Greek that you mentioned. Rosemary, go ahead.
Well, I was inspired to get in the queue when Bruce asked about approaching occult science as quote unquote naive realism. There's probably a reader out there for whom that designation would apply. But as we can see from what Max just brought, some kind of a label like naive realism doesn't fit all sizes of everyone who's taking this up. And depending on how long you've been studying anthroposophy or how dedicated you are to following a path of your own inner development toward Christian Rosicrucian initiation, you would be taking this book as one of many treatments of creation and evolution that Steiner gave, as well as one of many treatments of the origin of evil. There's just a huge amount of material that Steiner left on Lucifer and Ahriman. There's a lecture series called Evolution and the Aspect of Realities that tells the story of creation from the point of view of the spiritual hierarchies. In other words, they're the key players. So everybody will be reading occult science according to their preparation as a scholar, the amount of belief and receptivity they have to what Steiner brings. And that's one of the reasons that this is such a great group, because we have people who are all over the place in approaching this. So I think we should hold that question about how to take occult science and come back to it every once in a while, because we're all growing in our understanding of what it is.
Amen. Thanks, Rosemary. Jeff, go ahead.
Well, I should have gone before Max, because I would have said much of what he said in a muddled fashion, and then it would look like he was clearing me up. But instead, I'm just going to be muddled and follow that just absolutely wonderful. What do you say? Cohesive wandering of thought that was so beautifully descriptive of the answer, in a certain sense, to Bruce's question, which is just a great question. It's a question, I agree, Rosemary, we should keep coming back to. And one answer, I mean, there's probably 12, right? There's probably 12 points of view one could take on this as a way to get a grip on a feeling for an understanding that would be sufficient, say. And of course, that depends on each individual. But my short answer is phenomenology, and that's sort of where Max was so beautifully articulating that we is this the way the world works? What Steiner is describing, is it the way the world generates itself? And the answer is in our soul. I think the answer is in the way in which we are participants in the generative process. And we do that. Thankfully, we read Philosophy of Freedom, as I mentioned in a previous episode of ours, where this process, this genesis is part of the epistemological process, and indeed what Janelle Schickler refers to as an onto-epistemological process, that we're actually creating a reality that is symbolically, in the sense of likely story, iconically alongside of this reality. So we're always doing this. And I identify with this very strongly. So one could also ask, is there such a thing as naive realism? Or are we never in a naive realistic state, but the memorative aspect is something we forget that we're bringing to the table, to the given. And so we have what John Vervaeke describes as a way to overcome this self-deception or bullshitting ourselves. And I think in that process, there's in the epistemological process, we can see what is memory transparently. And so I want to take this back real quick, because this is also going to be a wondering, back to where he's talking about the astounding memory that human beings would have had at a time when the Luciferic influence was strong and the sensory experience was fixed to the earth. So much so, this extraordinary memory remembered its own ontogenesis, say, and remembered the ways in which and this is not remembering anymore as we think of it. It's not representative remembering. It's an alongsiding with the way plants and animals generate, right? And so this is, to me, this is what he was describing in that section, is that what Goethe touches upon, what we refer to with Michael Levin, and this sort of anti-space he's kind of pointing to, that out of that which things generate, we could say, not do we give the astral body and the etheric body physical characterization, but we give the physical body astral and etheric characterization, if that means something, right? So phenomenologically, I don't really experience my physical body other than something other, but I do experience my complex emotional life, that which I'm participating in generating, and I do participate in a conceptual bringing out of nothing ideas that emerge. And if that is generating out of something living and extemporaneous, then I'd say that the physical body is a mere representation of the etheric and the astral, I would say. And to sum that, not to sum it up, but just to add, I think that this mystery that he points to as relates to memory is a memory of the eternal, in that it's Plato's idea that all knowledge is a kind of remembering, and that we generate through our own generation of our own desires, our own memory process that is neither eternal nor physical, but is independent of both, if that makes sense. So that's again a meandering, but pretty complete for my taste.
Thank you, Jeff. Lorenzo, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Sorry for the noise, if you can hear it, but there's a hailstorm around me, and I wanted to take this problem about what we read in the occult science and the relationship with the phenomenological point of view, and how there's some kind of problem, let's say some kind of paradox in the idea that on one hand, we have to think that the world, the object, and the subject are originally the same, and that this division is something that is constructed, and the idea of describing the evolution of the world way before conscience was there, or at least we can see that the I is or we could also speak about the body of light, the astral body comes later on, and so there's this apparent paradox. And yeah, we can look at phenomena, seeing them as stratified, as having many levels, and inside the levels of the synchronous phenomenon, look for the quality that justifies a metaphysics and a history of evolution. But nevertheless, we have to deal with this paradoxical nature of the of how how conscience and so subjectivity arises in this picture after a world that is depicted objectively. And I would just like to propose a couple of ideas. I haven't really developed them fully. I just will propose them to stir some thoughts. And one idea is that well, if the phenomenon is not, I mean, the unity of object and subject is really to be taken as originary, then we should think of this past evolution of the world as something that is retro caused, or we should look at some kind of causality moving backwards in time, because that is, I guess, the only solution. I mean, it's like, even if we are born together, subject and world, if this world has a past, then it's like that past is being created in the moment of the apparition of subjectivity. So there must be something going back, some kind of force that's working retroactively. And then I ask myself, well, do we see anything like that in Steiner? And yes, we get this idea that in dreams, times goes backwards, and this again is seen after death, when during, let's say, purgatory, we go back through our lives, through all those nights that we've slept, and so we see that there are these retro causations in Steiner, and so maybe there's something there. Maybe we should go even further than Steiner went, and try to understand all the different phases of this evolution, as and even the different agencies, maybe the hierarchies. We should understand the different hierarchies as different ways in which the future acts on the past. This could, you could imagine like something that's outside time, let's call it eternity, and when it acts in time, it appears in time as a kind of hierarchy. Then we could think of another entity that lives outside great cycles, but not the whole cycle. The whole cycle is still moving for them, yet they see great cycles as still, and when they act into those cycles, they then appear as a different hierarchy. And yeah, and so if we think about it that way, we notice then there's another peculiarity in what Steiner is telling us, that is the phases and pauses, active phases and then pauses. And this is interesting because I mean, I don't think he really gives a rationale for this. I'm not sure. Maybe I missed it, but we could find a different rationale in this way of understanding that I was talking about. That let's think, for example, when one records a song, and then he wants to record some backward sounds. Let's take, you want to record a backward guitar. Then what you have to do, you have to first record the straight track. Let's say you record the chords, let's say, and the song lasts for, let's say, 4 minutes. Okay, you've recorded that, and then you have to rewind it and play and record along it while it is rewinding. So I mean, this can also be more general. I mean, every time I have to create overdubbing, I have to rewind the first stratum of the recording, and then I record the second level, and so we can see that there is a time when the record has to be rewinded. Let's say that I want to make a record with many instruments, I cannot really play all at once. So I go back and forward. I record one instrument and then I go back. And then the tape is the same, but if there is someone who is taping the whole process outside of me, he will see that I first recorded the tape, then I send it backwards, and then I repeat it. So we get these different phases. And I think this, I mean, maybe I muddled it a little, but I hope I managed to give you an impression of how what I was saying earlier about the hierarchies and how things outside time appear into time, and how this, if we think about then all the different times put one after the other, then we would necessarily see periods of activity and then a period when something is passive because it's being rewinded, while it is active on another level, but that's invisible because it's a different direction of time. I hope I didn't make too much confusion, but I think that there's a straight link between retrocausation and the problem of the, let's say, epistemological problem, philosophical problem we were dealing before, and the idea of retrocausation and the need for segments, phases with pauses. If you see them from one side, then one phase will be active, the next one will be passive, the next one will be active again, while on another level they would be all active, but the tape would change direction, so to speak. Thank you.
You, Lorenzo. Bruce, go ahead.
Well, I really like what Lorenzo has said. I'm not sure I've got the whole tape analogy, but it's because I don't do that kind of work. Perhaps I know the basics of that, but the basic idea that I really liked was the idea of backward causation. And I think that there's really something there. Now, I don't know how to explain that. I was going to say something very different, but the language I would have to use to say what I was going to say is going to have to be the subjectivist language too. And it's going to just put other beings, so to speak, in the process that are going to look like they're objective beings, like we're talking about the spirits of form or the other things, as if they were like we think we are when we're thinking in our normal everyday waking consciousness. So I guess I'm going to throw the stuff I wanted to say away and try to say something about what Lorenzo was saying about backward causation. So, and I always think that it's better for me to speak out of my direct experience than trying to quote other people, because for me, the other people are not in my direct experience because I'm not a philosopher and I haven't studied them the way that many of you had. So, but I can say that I definitely experienced something coming from the future. And it is like an aspect of my ego, not my ego, but my I. Because Steiner says at one place that the ego lives in the past. And I got that too. I mean, it's a weird thing, but it is back there. And I see that. But there's this other thing that in some ways is the same thing as the ego, but in a transformed way that comes from the future. So that's the first observation. The second observation is if you follow Emerson, through his natural history of the intellect, and you take that seriously, he gets through about a little farther than the middle of the point of the work, and he's talking about the I. And it starts to look like everything comes out of the I. So my take on that is that everything is inside of me. All experience is really internal experience. There is no external world, what I can make of it. in the way that we think of an external world in our normal, everyday, waking day consciousness when we haven't studied Steiner or any philosophy. And when I made that switch to starting to think more, I made that switch a long time ago, but when I really started taking it seriously, which was not very long ago, I started to have experiences of these beings that Steiner talks about. I could follow Steiner in a different way because it was like, as someone said to me a long time ago, the spiritual world is here and we're looking over here. And making that switch to looking at the world inside of me let me turn my head a little bit in a different way. I know this isn't coherent and it's not supposed to be coherent. I wanted to share kind of these experiences to say that there's something to what Lorenzo is saying, that this I, which is more than our ego coming from the past more, coming from the future, is somehow really creative of the past. And I know that that is really weird in normal waking day consciousness, but I think it's probably right.
Thanks, Bruce. People have been saying it a bit in the chat, but one potential way of thinking about this is in terms of final causation and like a lure, potential lure of the future. And I think Steiner even talks this way a lot about like there's like this sort of ideal trajectory, but it could go otherwise. And even the morphological perspective, like Laura suggested with the flat, like the plants, there's a kind of like musical theme, that gives a sense of what the future might have, but it could deviate. Anyway, we'll wrap up with Max because we're at time. Go ahead, Max.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to just pick up on the idea of causality and the direction of causality. Once again, I'd be inclined to try to understand and conceptualize the problem by rather than speculating about something outside of experience, trying to pay more closer, be more attentive to what we do actually experience. And I'd like to just invite everybody to imagine how you arrived at wherever you're sitting at your desk. But then imagine that, so however you traveled, however you walked to arrive where you are, imagine that same event, not from the point of view that you did experience it, but from the point of view of one of your cells. One of your cells would have been basically carried along for the ride, right? So you have an overarching intention that basically structures everything that then kind of all of the physical and measurable phenomena and events that then kind of follow that intention, like the wake of a ship. And so that's a way of seeing that from different perspectives. One thing can seem either, so I mean, that's an example of everything that's happening to the cells is being basically caused by, if it's not the future, it's definitely not the like, I guess, mode of efficient causality that we usually think of in terms of material objects. And so that, this is always kind of on the periphery of science and especially biology, but that's an obvious example of teleological causation or final causality I mean, Ashton brought this up about final causality. Those are very comparable terms. But in other words, the entire sequence of events is structured by a telos or a goal that is transparent and part of, inherent to your own consciousness and intention. Now, just to connect the dots here, I think Steiner's inviting us to think of what we ordinarily conceive of, the revolution of planets and the changing of the seasons and so on, not as just accidental events, but actually that they're orchestrated by an intelligence for whom those kind of events are just as transparent to us as our own, as the movements of our own physical bodies.
Thanks, Max. That's a great way to wrap up. Just wanted to make a little announcement before we jump off. I'm sadly going to be absent in 2 weeks because I'll be traveling. And so if anyone would like to take up the summary that week, that would spare Matt from doing it 2 weeks in a row. But yeah, so just an invitation. He's very capable of it if he needs to. But yeah. Anyway, thanks everybody for being here, and see you next week.